And now, airing from Rye, the Quatious podcast.
And welcome to the Quatious Podcast, U.S. History Edition. We're out here learning history because those who don't are doomed to repeat it. And we're joined today by the professor of U.S. history for Stanford University, a PhD, the one, the only, Dr. Law.
Hi there. Hello.
Hi there, hello. How you doing on this fine day?
Pretty well. Thank you for having me on. What are we talking about today?
I'm glad you asked. Today's subject will be sectionalism and the Civil War. The 19th century was a fascinating era for U.S. history. Simply fascinating.
Wonderful.
But before we get started, I just wanted to give a huge thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, Annan Flag Makers. Annan Flag Makers, America's #1 flag maker since 1847, which, by the way, is right in the era we're about to talk about. So, Dr. Law, could you provide some context for what was going on in those early to mid 1800s and how that, sets the vibe going into the Civil War?
Yeah, so right after the Jacksonian era and all of his nonsense, the two-party system fractures into five different parties. Obviously, this wasn't sustainable and really just inefficient, and this is really just the beginning of the total implosion of all three branches of government we're about to see. But around this time, we're seeing a rise in romanticism, whether it be in art, literature, music, etc. And this romanticism really feeds into the Second Great Awakening.
The Second Great Awakening. Oh, yeah!
Um,
Sorry.
yeah. And during this, a lot of people start to recontemplate morality, particularly in a religious context. So we start to see a bunch of reform movements popping up, the first wave of feminism, temperance, and most importantly, in the circumstances surrounding the Civil War, abolitionism.
Hey, folks, quick PSA here, just to clear up any confusion for a few people. Not gonna name any names, but y'all, slavery was the root cause of the Civil War. Just saying.
Right. So anyways, at this point, we're seeing the Frederick Douglasses and Harriet Tubmans of the world starting to show up, along with the Underground Railroad, and as we've seen throughout American history, and even world history, every bit of progress is met with backlash, and sadly, the abolitionists were not the exception.
Oh, yeah, I'm guessing you're referencing the Dred Scott v. Sandford decision?
Yes, I am referencing the Dred Scott v. Sandford decision. So, right, before this, we've been going back and forth with lines, then ignoring those lines, and then compromises.
Right?
This decision nullifies basically all of that, making it so that slavery is legal in all states because the governments can't regulate what Americans can do with their property. But in the midst of this, tensions have been rising to the point of violence. The Brooks Summer Affair, in which a pro-slavery congressman beat a pro-abolition congressman unconscious, was particularly heinous. Can you imagine something like that happening today?
You know, unfortunately, yes. Yes, I can.
That's a good point. There was also that maniac John Brown. Many wanted him hanged, which is what eventually happened, though far too late. But many also saw him as a martyr for abolitionism.
Jeez Louise.
And finally, during all of this, the most irrelevant president in American history
Okay.
was sitting in office.
Okay, I think that's the most passionate I've ever heard you get.
Don't even get me started on that good for nothing James Buchanan. I could talk about him all day. Now, don't get me wrong, there have been worse presidents. It's just that this guy did nothing. He literally accomplished nothing. He sucked. Sorry. The point is, with all three branches in complete disarray and the people's anger building, intensifying, we see all this escalate to the tipping point right after the election of 1860.
Here comes Lincoln.
That's right. The moment he wins, South Carolina gets started on drafting their Declaration of Succession, and the rest of the soon-to-be-called Confederacy follows suit in the succeeding months.
Well, this is all great stuff, but we gotta go to break. Don't leave. We'll be right back with more Dr. Law.
This program shall resume in a moment.
Welcome back to this episode of the Quatious Podcast. We're sitting here with the Dr. Law. Now, Dr. Law, before the break, we were discussing the sectionalism that built up to the Civil War. Now, let's talk about the Civil War itself.
Let's.
Loving the enthusiasm, sir. Okie dokie. Could you get us going with how the first shots went down?
I love to. So, at this point, the Confederate States of America had formed, but the United States of America did not recognize them as a separate entity, and they maintained this mentality throughout the war.
Oh boy, oh boy.
Yeah. So, when the Confederate troops surrounded Fort Sumter in South Carolina, Lincoln was in a bit of a pickle. He could A. Fire on the Confederate troops.
But he still saw them as citizens of the U.S.
Right. So, B. He could surrender the fort.
But that would just legitimize the Confederacy, which Lincoln didn't see as legitimate. This is indeed quite the pickle. A pretty big pickle.
Correct. So, he went another route.
Oh, really?
He resupplied the Union soldiers, really just leaving the ball in the Confederacy's court.
Smart move.
The Confederacy ends up attacking the fort. The Union ended up surrounding the fort soon after, but this kind of worked out well for Lincoln. One, he could now leverage the fact that they fired first, and two, no blood was shed.
That did work out pretty well.
Except the mule. A mule would perish.
Rip mule.
Rip mule.
Now, let's transition to comparing the two sides of the Civil War. The leaders, the resources, the soldiers.
Yeah, so when starting a new country, you're probably not going to have many advantages over an established one in a conflict. That's why the American Revolution was such an upset. The Confederacy was not exempted from this. From economic resources to military strength, the Union had almost a complete advantage. The few things that the Confederacy could lean on were more experienced leaders. They had a bunch of West Point graduates, like Robert E. Lee himself, and home turf advantage, though this may have been more of a sign of weakness.
Oh, how so?
Well, if you're only fighting on your own land, it may be due to the fact that you're not making many inroads in your efforts.
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify something you said earlier.
Go ahead.
You're 100% right in saying that the root cause of the Civil War was slavery. This is not up for debate. However, the purpose was different. Lincoln, in fact, stated that his primary objective was to reunite the states, regardless of what was to occur with slavery. As a side note, I get that this concept may be a little tricky to grasp, but certain people should definitely know this already.
I feel like I know who you're referencing right there.
But to be clear, Lincoln was an abolitionist. It's just that he could not afford to lose support in the buffer states.
Buffer states?
Yes. Lincoln used these as a justification that the Confederate states could not complain about the Union taking away slavery, since the buffer border states still had legalized slavery. They also provided geographical protection for Washington, D.C. If they outlawed slavery, it was highly likely that these buffer states would succeed. Of course, that ties into the Emancipation Proclamation, but we'll get to that soon.
Actually, very soon it turns out, because the next topic of our discussion is the turning points of the Civil War.
This is the good stuff.
I couldn't agree more.
Are you crying? Never mind. So despite the disadvantage of the Confederate states that they had, they were actually doing pretty well. The reason for this was the leadership. Our original military commander was George McClellan, and his deal was that he wasn't just aggressive enough. The Battle of Antietam was the epitome of his incompetence.
The bloodiest single day in American history.
And it was kind of all for naught. The Union troops were able to get the Confederates to retreat, but McClellan decided against going after them. This was the breaking point for Lincoln, so he fired him. Nonetheless, this Union victory increased morale in the North.
But that isn't the last we're gonna hear of McClellan.
No, it's not. But before I get more of him, I've got to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation.
Oh, rhyming executive orders are rad.
This one is a big one, too. It freed all enslaved people in the rebelling states. Note that I said rebelling, not all. Lincoln still couldn't afford to lose the buffer states, and even though they weren't affected, the buffer states were still a little unhappy with this, and it allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. This was really huge because it took manpower away from the Confederacy while simultaneously boosting the Unions.
Oh, taking manpower from the Confederacy while boosting your own is rad.
Okay, yeah, that's what I just said. Also, who uses rad? Never mind. The next turning point is one of the most infamous battles in U.S. history.
The Battle of Gettysburg.
This was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, but at the end, the Union came out on top, and the Confederacy never invaded the North again. Then immediately afterwards, on the USA's 87th birthday, the siege of Vicksburg was finally won by Ulysses S. Grant's troops, which was crucial to the Anaconda Plan.
Anaconda Plan? Ooh, can I jump in here?
Haha, it's your podcast.
Indeed it is. For my herpetologists out there, a word which here means people who are involved in the study of amphibians and reptiles, in this case snakes, you'll know that the genus Eunectes are a species of non-venomous constrictors. They squeeze their prey to death. Basically, the Union's plan was to choke out the Confederacy, and capturing the port of Vicksburg along the Mississippi River let them complete the chokehold.
Couldn't have explained it better myself.
Well, thank you kindly. Now, despite these successes, Lincoln was still worried that he would actually lose the upcoming election of 1864 to, drumroll please, his former military commander, George B. McClellan. What did Lincoln do about this?
He went to General Sherman and told him, and I paraphrase, go Rambo on those Southerners. And that's exactly what he did. Sherman went into total war. During Sherman's march to the sea, he literally obliterated everything in his wake. He broke the Confederacy's morale. And just like that, Lincoln got a second term.
Ha ha, take that, McClellan. That was insane, yo. That would make a pretty good movie.
So after all this, the grand finale, the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Earlier in 1865, the Union troops had surrendered Richmond, Virginia, aka the capital of the Confederacy, but President Davis set it on fire in his escape so that the Union couldn't have it. But finally, on April 9, 1865, General Grant and General Lee meet, and Lee surrenders the Confederate Army.
Oh, what a nice, happy ending.
The Civil War remains as the deadliest conflict in the United States history, with over 600,000 estimated casualties, not to mention the fact that Lincoln would be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth less than a week later.
Okay. Brilliant. Great way to end that segment. We gotta go to break. Next up, the consequences and legacy of the Civil War. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of this guy, Dr. Law.
This program shall resume in a moment.
You're back listening to the Quatious podcast, and we're about to discuss the consequences and legacy of the Civil War with Dr. Law. So, what were the short-term effects of the Civil War?
Well, after the election of 1864, Lincoln actually switched vice presidents. Until 1865, the vice president had been Hannibal Hamlin, but to make the United States seem more bipartisan, he appointed the extremely racist Southerner Andrew Johnson. Lincoln, before the assassination, of course, had a balanced plan for Reconstruction, but now that Andrew Johnson was POTUS, there was a lot of conflict. Johnson was being extremely lenient on the former Confederate states, while Congress wanted to really punish them, hence the ensuing political turmoil. The Republicans had a supermajority in Congress, so there was a lot of back and forth, forming progressive bills, vetoes of those bills, veto overrides, impeachment, and consequently, martial law in the South. This military enforcement of legislation contributed to the ever-present societal fear of large government in the South. Also, post-war Southern America was economically devastated. It's safe to say that in the years immediately following the Civil War, there was a lot of rockiness in the country.
Rocky!
Dude, you good?
Never better. How are you?
Well, I'm doing well, but
What would you say are the lessons our society can learn from everything we talked about today?
well, I really like the tagline of this podcast, learning history so that we aren't doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
We live in a time of vast political and societal tension, and though not the same as the sectionalism of the 19th century, the violence it has caused cannot be ignored. To say it isn't reminiscent of the past is, quite frankly, myopic. We as a country, whether it be on the right, left, or middle, need to re-examine what it means to be the United States. We need to study America's history, not ban it. We need to hear the best of each other's arguments, not cancel every gosh darn opinion that diverges from our own beliefs by the slightest degree.
Hashtag deep. Alrighty then. That'll be all for the Quatious podcast today. Dr. Law, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always,
Stay quacious.
This program has ended. Look away, there's nothing more to see here. This very fastidious distribution of information is over. Please leave. This extremely well thought out, not at all corny project has come to a close. Thus, it is beyond me why you continue to observe it.